So in the previous video, we've learned how to issue a JWT token through a fake login. Now it's about time that we use this JWT token in subsequent requests. And you are going to learn how to do exactly that in this video. So let's go, and let's do it. So when a token gets decoded, it actually needs to get decoded into what is called a user principal. Wait, before we continue, let's clear something up. An authentication principal is not a user. They are similar, yes, they might even overlap a lot, but they are different. Even though it may not be technically correct, but I like to think about a user as a person and their authentication principal as their ID card. You pass through security with your ID card, but it is different from you as a person. Now, let's get back to the video. So let's make a user principal in our application. Inside the security package, let's make a new class and let's call this UserPrincipal. And UserPrincipal is not the same as user. So with the UserPrincipal class created, let's make it implement an interface called user details that comes from Spring Security user details. And let's make it actually implement those methods. And immediately after you allow your IDE to fill in those empty methods, scroll down and change all of these falses to true. This is a very, very common mistake that people actually forget to change these and then nothing works and they ask questions on Stack Overflow. So let's make true, 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 true. And you really gotta love those like double negatives in the method names. Is account non-expired? Yes, it is non-expired. Is account non-locked? It is non-locked. True. Is credentials non-expired? They are non-expired, therefore true. And is user enabled? Yes, he is. Now let's fill this principal with information that comes from our JWT token. Right here, let's tag this as getter and builder. You gotta love those Lombok builders. And let's do a private final long user ID, private final string email, because that's what I have in my token. And then there also needs to be a list of granted authorities, which has this crazy type right here. So let me just copy this right here. Let's call this authorities. And don't really mind what that means just yet. It is going to work, trust me. So in your methods, return the authorities where it asks for authorities. Password, let's leave that null for now. Username, let's just do that as email. And this is a very simple user principal. Now Spring wraps user principal into something called authentication token. So let's create a custom version of that that actually takes our own custom user principal. If you're not understanding this just yet, just hold on tight. This is going to work and you will probably understand how it works in the end. So inside our security package, let's make another class and let's call this one UserPrincipal Authentication Token. And let's make this extend abstract authentication token from Spring Security. Let's implement the methods that it needs. And what is it complaining about? It's complaining about a super constructor. So let's also do that. Let's remove this Java doc because it is not representative of what we are trying to do here. And we are only going to have the constructor with our user principal. And let's store it as a private field, user principal. Let's call it principal. And when the constructor is called, the super constructor needs authorities, but we already have that inside the principal. So we can just say super principal dot get authorities, and now it's no longer complaining. And one final thing that we need to do is to assign this principal to the principal passed into the constructor. Now, if you scroll down a little bit, there's this overridden method here called getPrincipal. So here, let's just return our principal. And since it's an any object, let's make it more concrete. And let's make it return our user principal. Notice that our application still runs and compiles. At no point we have broken it. So that is always a good thing. Let's continue working towards making this token work. So how do you go from something arbitrary looking like this token into something that is actually usable inside of Spring, such as UserPrincipal? Well, you need to take a couple of steps, and one of the first steps is decoding the token string into actually decoded token. So let's create a new class in the security package, and let's call it JWT Decoder or JWT Decoder. Let's mark this as component, and let's do a required args constructor because we're going to be injecting some beans into it. So what is it doing? It is decoding a string token. How does it do that? Well, let's return, oops, this is void. Just from experience, I know that a decoded token is of type Decoded JWT interface. That comes from Auth0. If you have any more of these, just make sure this comes from Auth0. And now we can return to JWT capitals, and that is class from Auth0 dot. And you might be tempted to actually call this decode, but don't, because if you read the documentation, it says decode a given JSON web token. Note that this method does not verify the token's signature. So if somebody fakes that signature, it would still work. What you need to do is you need to do JWT.require together with an algorithm that you used for signing it. And if you remember, that was HMAC 256. So let's do algorithm HMAC 256, and we can conveniently use the JWT properties that we set up a while back. So let's inject those. Let's do private final JWT properties, and here we're gonna do properties get secret key. After that, we need to build, and then we need to verify the actual token that was passed as an argument. Right now, this is very simple, but you can actually do a lot of requirements for this token. If you just check a line before the build and you just press dot, you can ask for any claims for issuer. Let's say you have many servers and you only want to take it issued by one particular server. You can do that. We're not going to do that for this tutorial, but if you want, you could. So how do we convert this decoded JWT to UserPrincipal? Well, I'm going to make yet another class for that. Inside our security package, let's do a new class, and this one is going to be called JWTPrincipal Converter. As always, let's mark this as a component. This is not going to be injecting anything, so I'm not adding a required args. And let's do a public class that returns a UserPrincipal. Let's call it convert, and let's take in decoded JWT. Let's call this JWT. And now let's just try step by step to return the UserPrincipal. Return UserPrincipal builder build. This would work already, but let's actually populate it with our user ID, and user ID comes from JWT dot subject That is a standard, and it comes as a string, so you know that you've encoded a number. So what you could do is you can just do a long value of, and then JWT get subject. What else do we have there? We have email. So that came from our custom claim, and that you can do get claim. We were calling this E, and let's get it as a string. Now, the only remaining thing is authorities, and these require a collection of things that extend granted authority. So let's create a private method for that, because this is going to be a little bit more involved. Let's do this private list of simple granted authority, and let's call this extract authorities from claim. And let's extract those authorities from our decoded JWT, and let's see what we can do here. So let's do a JWT.getClaim, and our authorities came in a claim called A. This is where I'm gonna stop and do what is called a guard clause. So if a claim is null or missing, we're gonna return an empty list. This token does not come with any authorities. And now that we ensure that claim is not null and is not missing, we can just return that claim as a list of simple granted authority. Now let's call this method and put it inside our authorities, extract authorities, pass in a JWT, and your converter is done. It is finally time to bring all those difficult steps together. And that is done inside JwtAuthenticationFilter. So let's create yet another class. Let's create that in the security package, and let's call that JwtAuthenticationFilter. And this class extends from once per request filter that comes from Spring Framework Web Filter. It needs to implement a single method of doFilterInternal. And very important, immediately, filter chain.doFilter request response. That's very important. When people miss that, things don't work. And that is a very common mistake. Now let's not forget to mark this as a component, and let's do required args constructor, because we are going to be injecting what we just made before. Private final JWT Decoder that we just made. Let's call this JWT Decoder, and another one JWT to principal converter. Well, let's just call it JWT to principal converter. So the first thing that we need to do here is to extract the token from authorization header from our request. That's going to be a little bit involved, so I'm going to make it in a private method. And token can exist or it can be absent. So I'm going to make this optional, and it's going to be optional of string. So if token exists, this returns a token. If it doesn't, it returns an empty optional. Let's call this method extract token from request. And that is going to take HTTP servlet request as an argument. That is where we are extracting it from. Now let's do a var token equals request dot get header. And the standard for this is to call it authorization. Now, if you read the documentation of getHeader, it says returns a string or null if request does not have a header of that name. So this is either a string or a null. Let's check for that. Do if string utils that come from Spring framework because we are using Spring dot has text and just pass in token. Now, what does has text do? It returns true if string is not null and its length is greater than 0. So even if it's an empty string, this has text will return false. So that's exactly what we want. What we also want is to conform to a standard where the value starts with bearer, space, and then the token. So let's also check for that. And if token starts with bearer, space, then we want to return an optional of token dot substring 7. Why is that? That is because when we receive a authorization token, it's usually something like this. Authorization, and then we have bearer, and then we have the JWT token. So we actually want to drop this bearer, and that is exactly 7 characters, as you can see. So when we're doing a substring, we're actually only taking this part. Now, in any other case, we just want to return an empty optional. Now, let's finally tie all of this together. Back in your doFilter internal and above doFilter, call your extract token from request, pass in a request, and now we can do a couple of steps that transform it a couple of times, and then it gets added to the security. So below that, do a dot map, and this comes from optional API. It's very similar to streams. And let's do a JWT Decoder, and then let's call decode. By the way, let me show you real quick if you don't know what's happening here. So map's argument is a lambda, and since this is an optional of string, it has a string. So if I just call our JWT Decoder dot decode and pass in that string, you can see that IntelliJ says that, hey, this can be optimized. And it says lambda can be replaced with a method reference. So I'm just going to do exactly that. And this is what we get. JWT Decoder decode. That is called a method reference. Don't worry if it's confusing, just follow along and it's going to work in the end. So what we are doing here is we are extracting the token and then we are decoding the token string into a decoded JWT. The next step after that is map JWT to principal converter, convert, so we're converting the decoded token into a principal. And then our principal needs to be wrapped with an authentication token. So here we have another map, and let's do UserPrincipal authentication token new. So what this is doing is it's creating a new UserPrincipal authentication token that we just made, and it is passing a UserPrincipal as a constructor argument. And after all these steps, if it is present, let's just call this authentication for short, arrow, and this is where it connects to Spring. So security context holder that comes from Spring Framework security core context dot get context dot set authentication, and then pass in that authentication. And one final step to make this work, open your security config, and you need to make Spring aware of your filter. So inside web security config, if you haven't already, put a required args constructor and then inject your JwtAuthenticationFilter. And inside the security configuration bean, just do http://add_filter before, point this to your filter, JwtAuthenticationFilter, and do this before username password authentication filter class. Another way to do this is to pass it in as a bean argument. That will also work. It's just, I like it this way better. Argue in the comments about this to boost engagement. And that is it. We have all the pieces to make Spring work with JWT tokens. Let's go to our hello controller and let's make some sort of a secured endpoint. So that's going to be any endpoint, any request, because if we check back here, we say any request needs to be authenticated. So let's try that. Let's do a get endpoint and let's call it secured. Secured. And let's return, if you see this, then you're logged in. And let's run the application. The application is now running. Let's try and call localhost 8080/secured. And if we do this without anything, just raw, it will say 403 forbidden. So that is what we expecting. But if we issue ourselves a token, just copy this one and go to authorization, bearer token, and we paste that in. That is still forbidden for some reason. Ah, yes, and that is happening because of another very common mistake. If I open my UserPrincipal authentication token, I have forgot to do set authenticated true. And now if I run my application, everything should work just as intended. And there you go. If you see this, then you're logged in. If I remove the token and I launch this, I get 403 forbidden. So if you only needed to get started, this is where you can stop and continue with your project. But we're gonna make this even better. So stay tuned to see how this can be improved. Boy, oh boy, these videos are getting longer and longer. But the good thing is that you now have a pretty good base to start you off with your project. But the series is not over yet. Now in the next video, we're gonna go back to the login, and instead of having a fake login, we're gonna make a real login. And as always, before you click off, don't forget to like this video so you can find it later, share it with your colleagues, and if you want more of this content, please subscribe. Now let's go to another video.